Maggie Gundersen founded Fairwinds Associates, which is a paralegal and expert witnesses firm, in 2003, and prior to that, she held several positions in the nuclear power industry, and that included being the public information specialist at a proposed nuclear power plant in upstate New York. Arnie Gundersen is chief engineer for Fairwinds. He has a master's degree in nuclear engineering and more than 40 years of nuclear power experience in engineering areas. He holds a nuclear safety patent, was a licensed reactor operator, and is a former nuclear industry senior vice president. And Arnie also managed and coordinated projects at 70 U.S. nuclear power plants. So between both Maggie and Arnie, we have folks that have been inside the nuclear power industry and know an awful lot about how it works, including the technical and legal aspects, and also some of the, you could call them social aspects too, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. The Gundersens are authors of the best-selling Japanese language book, Fukushima Daiichi, The Truth and the Way Forward. And they have been among the most prominent voices in the U.S. and international news media since the Fukushima disaster happened. I'll note that Maggie and Arnie provided very important technical expertise for NC Warren and our allies during federal proceedings regarding flaws that led regarding the AP1000 reactor design by Westinghouse that Duke Energy is proposing to build. Their work helped lead to a federal lawsuit that we and our allies pushed to try to force the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to incorporate changes in the AP1000 design that were urged by the NRC's own A-team of experts. We'll be talking more about that. I encourage you to take a look at fairwinds.org, Fairwinds with an E, to learn more about their important work on Fukushima and other issues. So anyway, we're very happy to welcome Arnie and Maggie Gundersen.
We were part of what was a nuclear renaissance back then, and it's, you know, now we're seeing another one. Our talk tonight is entitled The Nuclear Renaissance, ? Is there one? And is it too big to fail? The reason that we use that phrase is we wanted you all to think about the Wall Street debacle and the banks, and were they too big to fail? And we all know what happened in the banking industry. And we see those same lack of regulatory factors here in the nuclear industry.
You know, every complex system has failure modes that people don't think of. And it could be complex like a monetary system like the Wall Street banks. It could be the Death Star from Star Wars. Remember, Luke Skywalker found that one little port that was the critical weakness. And I like to say, when I'm talking about this, that on any of these complex systems, sooner or later, in any foolproof system, the fools are going to exceed the proofs. And it really doesn't matter what the system is. Given time, its flaws will be self-revealing, as the NRC's term.
We first met, as I said, in the nuclear industry. And since then, since Arnie was a nuclear whistleblower and we moved into our own practice of bringing safety flaws forward, we founded Fairwinds Associates, which is expert witness firm, as Jim said. And in some of our testimonies with Fairwinds Energy Education, that's when we first met Dr. Steve Wing. And we were talking about, at that time, too big to fail. We met at the anniversary of 3 Mile Island, 30th. And that event, I started to cry when Arnie finished and Dr. Wing got up and showed his epidemiology report, because for 30 years, Arnie had talked about what got out of the plant. And then Steve, and everyone said Arnie had to be lying. And Dr. Wing got up and talked about what he saw from an epidemiology standpoint. They had never met. They had never worked together. And you could see the dovetail of that data.
Yeah. It was fascinating because I had determined that the releases from 3 Mile Island were much greater than we were led to believe, right? Between 15 and 100 times greater. And I'm this voice in the wilderness, and then we bump into Steve, and he's got epidemiological evidence that supports the same thing, that the doses the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was claiming that people received couldn't support the epidemiological data that Steve had. So they really meshed together, and that was cool. And I saw that happening on the Gulf, the oil, BP. Same thing. What happened is the company said, oh, releases are small. And the same thing then happened right after Fukushima. I saw it happening again. Oh, there's not much being released from the plant, don't worry. It's nowhere near as bad as 3 Mile Island and things like that. So that was the point that fundamentally drove us to create the Fairwinds website, was that I said, I've seen it happen on 3 Mile Island. I've seen my country lie to me, and I'm not going to let it happen again. So, you know, that was the nexus that formed the Fairwinds website.
So part of what we're here to talk about tonight is what's happening in North Carolina and what's happening nationally in the nuclear industry.
Talk about too big to fail. This is the plants in the background are the Vogtle units that are about 30 years old, and the holes in the foreground are for the new Vogtle units. They're bigger and different, but still contain flaws that actually the engineers seem to design something to avoid one set of flaws, and in the process stumble into a different set of flaws, and we'll get into that in a minute. You want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I think what's happening here is there's Duke would not be building nuclear power plants except it can get 11% on its money for a huge amount of money. It's a nice business to be in. But the paradigm is changing, and they're fighting a rear guard action. If you look at the traditional utility model, it's big generators connected to a grid, almost like a tree with a couple big leaves. Well, that's not Mother Nature's model. Mother Nature's model is a tree with many, many small leaves. And the future of power, I think, will be what we call distributed generation, where you're going to see many solar systems and windmills and of course, conservation. But the net effect will be that if my house doesn't need the power and your house does, they'll be communicating back and forth as opposed to relying on huge power plants like huge leaves on some kind of a prehistoric tree. So the change is happening. You know, we saw it in computers. The computer I got my master's on was about the size of this room, 2 stories high, and has been replaced with this little Mac has more power than that computer ever had. And we've seen it. What happened to AT&T? You know, and cell phones have displaced landlines. The changes are coming, being driven by the same information technology. And actually, the last domino to fall is the utility industry. But I think they're next, and I think this distributed generation will change their paradigm. If they don't change with it, then they'll be out of business in 20 or 30 years. Okay, first thing we wanted to talk about.
It's right there.
Right here. Yeah. First thing we wanted to talk about was the cost and something that's called CWIP, which is called construction work in progress. There's a reason why the new nuclear plants are only being built in the southeast, and that's because you have compliant regulators who allow this thing called CWIP. Nowhere else in the country is this financing model available. And basically what they're doing is they're socializing the risk and they're privatizing the profit from a nuclear plant. Then a nuclear plant, let's say $20 billion. Well, for the 10 years or 15 years or perhaps even 20 years when it's being built, they can charge you the interest on that money plus the 11% allowable rate of return, even though the power plant isn't ever running. The only place that happens is in the southeast because of compliant regulators. So, you know, who wouldn't want to invest $20 billion at 11%? You know, here, take my retirement, please. This is a very lucrative deal. But what will happen eventually when these power plants get put into the rate base is that the cost of electricity is going to go up, not down. In Florida, I testified against 4 AP1000s. 2 have been canceled by Duke, and 2 are in indefinite limbo. But the 4 power plants in Florida would have increased the capital capacity of all the power plants in Florida by 45%. Financially, it would have been a 45% increase in the total capital that's tied up in generation. But the net effect on electricity was only an 8% increase in electricity. So to spend 45% more to get 8% more power doesn't seem to me to be a very good deal. The same will happen here. When these plants come online, electric costs are going to go up, and that's going to drive more people to conserve. It's going to chase businesses out of the area, not into the area. And the net effect then is there's more power than there is users, and you get into a death spiral, an upward spiral in increasing costs, because you're allowing the CWIP model to drive your financing.
And in some states, like in Florida, the ratepayers are paying for the plants that were supposed to be built now. A law was passed that they could pay while this was in process. And their rates have gone up astronomically. Our daughter has an extra $100 a year in her utility bill just for these nukes that now have been canceled and will never be built.
Yeah, yeah. And the last thing is, when you watch the financing on how they do the economics here, they spread the cost over 60 years, despite the fact that 20% of the nuclear plants that were built died before they got to 40 years. And that number is never in the economic analysis. The other piece of that is the oldest running nuclear plant has ever gotten to is 47 years. So your economic models are stretching out the amortization period. And the net effect is that it has the effect of making a compliant regulator think that costs will be much lower than they really are. Okay, you know, you hear about these new reactors. At first it was the AP1000. And by the way, that stands for Advanced Passive, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then they went to small modular, and there seems to always be a new reactor on the horizon. I like to call it the Little Orphan Annie syndrome. You remember that song, The Sun Will Come Out Tomorrow, and the beauty of tomorrow is it's always a day away. There's always another concept here for a nuclear power plant. But anyway, the fundamental problem remains the same. And this is where I'm going to need a pointer. A neutron hits a uranium atom and splits it and releases an enormous amount of energy. About 60 million times more energy is released in a fission than in a chemical reaction in a coal atom. So it's 60 million times more energy. And if it stopped right there, we wouldn't be here today. The only problem is that this and these pieces, this radioactive rubble that's left behind, also give off heat. only 97% of the heat occur when the uranium atom pops in half. 7% is from the radioactive rubble, the fission products that are left behind. So when you, quote, safely shut down a nuclear plant, you don't shut it down. There's no way to stop that 7% heat from being generated. Those fission products are not, the control rods are in, the reaction shut down, and still those fission products continue to churn heat. No matter what the reactor design is, that fundamental flaw continues.
And that's part of the problem at Fukushima Daiichi, in that the decay heat kept heating the water, and there was no way to get additional water to the plants. And so they started to boil dry, they had explosions. You know, it's this decay heat, and that same kind of scenario could happen anywhere in the United States, especially at the GE Mark I plants, BWR Mark Is.
Okay. Well, I think the lesson should be to expect the unexpected. You know, we've had 5 meltdowns in 35 years. We had 3 Mile Island, we've had Chernobyl, and we've had 3 meltdowns at Fukushima in 35 years. So that means the chance of a meltdown 35 divided by 5 is about 1 meltdown every 7 years. That's what history shows us. So we should expect the unexpected. But yet, regulators on a national level, the NRC and to a lesser degree state regulators are buying this 1 in a million probability. When you crank the numbers that the NRC uses, you come up with an accident, 1 in a million has 400 reactors. That works out to be about 1 every 2,000 years. But history's telling us we've had an accident, you know, every 7 years. And so the lesson should be expect the unexpected. And that applies to the AP1000 design as well as Fukushima. The clouds, by the way, the steam in the background on the Fukushima picture, is the decay heat that Maggie was talking about. The chain reaction shut down. There was no nuclear fission occurring. But these pieces, the radioactive rubble, were throwing up all that steam and energy.
And this, of course, is Bogle, and this is VC Summer, both of which they're trying to invest in here, and Duke is hoping to have more participation in those. Yep, Georgia and South Carolina, yeah.
What's the half-life of the decay of the waste?
Well, we'll come into the questions after.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a good question.
It's a
Yeah.
good question. We'll talk about that. Thanks. So,
Okay, so expect the unexpected is the last piece of our presentation, and we're going to focus on just the AP1000. But you know, history has told us that we should be anticipating the unexpected, and we're not. Okay, can I borrow that pen?
Yep.
Yeah. So the AP1000 design is unique because of this thing at the top. And what that is, that's 8 million pounds of water sitting on the roof of this building. This is a cutaway, and up here is a tank full of water. And if you know anything about structures, you know, people usually don't put the swimming pool on the roof. They usually put it in the basement. And the reason for that is that it sways in the event of an earthquake. So engineers put the water on the roof, figuring that in the event of an accident, if an accident occurred in here, the heat would remain in the containment and water would fall from the roof over the containment and steam would shoot out the top. And that would cool the reactor for 3 or 4 days without any human intervention. So the theory of the advanced passive design was, let's put 8 million pounds of water on the roof and let it trickle over the containment, and that will cool the reactor, and we won't need the emergency cooling pumps. Engineers knew when they built this, this was designed 15 years ago, that the single biggest problem in a power plant is something called loop, loss of offsite power. And this plant was designed to run without electricity. But that's not what happened at Fukushima. the industry would love to tell you, Duke will tell you, that it was a loss of off-site power event that, that caused the Fukushima accident. The earthquake knocked down the transmission lines, and the tsunami flooded the diesels, and the net effect was it had no power, loss of off-site power, which led to something called a station blackout, had no inside power either. But that's really not what happened at Daiichi. What happened at Daiichi is the wave came in and destroyed the cooling pumps along the ocean. So even if the diesels hadn't been swamped, the cooling pumps along the ocean would have been destroyed. And just like your car has a, you know, a radiator and a pump on the engine, if you lose that, you lose your diesels anyway. So what happened at Fukushima Daiichi wasn't a loss of off-site power leading to a station blackout. It was a loss of the ultimate heat sink. Keyword there is ultimate, meaning the Pacific Ocean came in and wiped out the pumps that were designed to cool the power plant. Well, this plant's ultimate heat sink is that tank of water on the roof. And the NRC is not really looking at loss of the ultimate heat sink as a credible accident. We brought up through N.C. Warren and John Runkle, where's John? Oh, there he is. John and I argued in front of the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards about problems in this design. And the NRC made them go away by saying they couldn't happen. There was just, by definition, that that tank is not going to fail, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. And that was the mentality that we had when we got in. So what happened was there's engineering trade-offs on the AP1000 design. In designing for loss of off-site power, they've created another problem, loss of the ultimate heat sink. They've made that problem go away because they've defined it as it can't happen. Literally, they have something called a SAMDA, Severe Accident Mitigation Design Analysis. And if you go into it, the probability of that tank failing is 0. Not 0.0001, but 0. It cannot and will not fail. And if you cook the books like that, you're going to come up with a design that has a critical flaw that has never been properly assessed. Well, the biggest problem, there's a couple. These four are the biggest problems of the AP1000 design. The AP1000 could not have been built in Japan. And, you know, so you'll hear Westinghouse and even Duke will say, well, if the AP1000 had been there, it would have survived the tsunami. Then we wouldn't have had this problem. The problem is it would not have survived the earthquake before the tsunami because it had all that weight on the roof. You can't even build an AP1000 in California. And I submit, if we really did the structural analysis right, the seismic analysis right, that even the earthquakes that you can anticipate in the southeast are going to jeopardize that tank of water on the roof. So the first thing is seismic issues can attack the tank on the roof. But related to that is let's go back for a minute here. It's pretty easy to see, which means from a terrorist standpoint, it's a target. And it is the target that can be hit by you know, the missiles or airplanes as well. And again, when you play the game the way the NRC plays it, they assume there's a 0 probability of a terrorist taking out the water tank that's so plainly evident on the roof of the building. So problem number one with the AP1000 is exactly the thing the engineers designed into it, the tank of water on the roof. To solve one problem, they've created another problem. The next problem is something we call the chimney effect. And what happens is this. This is, again, a cutaway of the AP1000 design. Heat is generated in here in the event of an accident. Water is supposed to fall through the tank onto the outside of a steel shell. And the water is supposed to evaporate and take off the heat that's generated inside. Well, through N.C. Warren, I did an analysis of containments and found out that there's a significant probability of a containment failing. So if the AP1000 containment gets a hole in it, and, I'm sorry, I'm dangerous with these buttons. If it got a little hole in it, that hole would release radioactivity from inside, outside, and right out the roof where the steam is supposed to be going. Now, we looked at, we meaning N.C. Warren and I, in the report that we presented to the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards, 5 months before Fukushima, we were there. We found out that about 7 or 8 reactors have sprung leaks in their containment over the years. And we actually had pictures we presented to the ACRS. And the NRC staff came in and said they assume there's 0 probability of a containment springing a leak. Well, if you assume 0 probability that the tank won't fail, of course it won't fail. And if you assume 0 probability of a leak being sprung, of course it won't happen. Well, we had 7 at the time, and then since then, a little thing like Fukushima Daiichi happened, and all 3 containments sprung leaks. So the NRC hasn't factored that into the AP1000 chimney effect. And just last month, Beaver Valley up in Pennsylvania sprung a leak as well. What the NRC did, this one's interesting. I love the logic. They found a leak in the containment, and they patched the leak, and then they pressurized the containment, and they said the containment doesn't leak. Well, if they had pressurized the containment before they patched it, they would have had a different result. But if you listen to the NRC, no containment has ever failed its containment leak rate test. The reason is they've never tested it before the leaks were plugged. There's at least now 10 reactors that have sprung leaks in their containment, but the AP1000 design assumes it cannot happen. And I really have to thank N.C. Warren for that. You know, it was, it's one, I can't crank out a report and give it to the NRC and expect to be heard. You need to be represented by somebody who's involved in the process. And these guys stuck their neck out, and I felt it was important work, even though we lost the battle. Where I think we're gradually winning the war. So my hat's off together. Okay, let's go back to the other thing is what's called a detonation shock wave. If you can remember back to Fukushima, Daiichi 1 blew up one day after the accident. And that, while violent, was relatively slow. It's called a deflagration. When a hydrogen explosion occurs, the pressure wave moves slower than the speed of sound. That's called a deflagration. But if you look at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 3, that was the one that blew up and sent a huge plume almost a mile high. That was a detonation shock wave. And what happens there is the shock wave travels faster than the speed of sound and can destroy any metal that's in the way. The AP1000 design, let's go back to that now, is this building, the inner envelope, the containment building, is designed for 50 pounds of pressure, a little bit less than a bicycle tire. And when you do the analysis shows that, don't worry, it's only going to hit 49.8. So there's plenty of margin, don't worry about it. But the margin doesn't take into account the detonation shock wave that we know to have happened. And again, the NRC makes that problem go away because they assume that a detonation shock wave cannot occur. So what we've seen in reality is assumed not to happen in history. And the last one, and all of these nuclear plants are their shared sites. You saw the picture of Vogtle, where there are 2 units of Vogtle and 2 new ones. What Fukushima taught us is that if there's an accident at one reactor, it's going to crosstalk into other reactors on the same site. And the AP1000 design is just as susceptible to that as any of the other ones. The problem at Vogtle 2 can likely impact Vogtle 3, and the NRC does not assume crosstalk between the units. Okay. hang on here. Maggie's going to take us home.
So the question for all of us to consider and think about is, as you're looking at the kind of work we do or that NC Warren does, and what you want in your futures, is what will U.S. choose as its energy picture? Will we continue to go down the path we've already had of large power plants? And as Arnie said, the power companies want that. I mean, 11%, as you know, take my money, invest it, and I'll make the 11%. For those of you down here in the South who these plants are being built by the companies that supply your energy, when they go belly up, that comes back and it hits all of our taxes. It's a federal tax, and we all will end up with some of that. So this is a favorite poem of ours from Robert Frost, who's a Vermont poet, and it's called The Road Not Taken. And two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down, one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. We have to choose a new energy path, and it's not something that only a few of us can do. We all have to work together to make it happen. Thank you.